I have a recording. I have a recording of my screen itself, just for the thing. I need that. Okay. Just want to find this. Okay, so yeah, so just to repeat what I was saying, the Arizal's kavanah is really the kavanah for literally putting on shoes. So it's actually a question which we should have, because I'm sure that some halacha kind of person already asked this question, because in our, at least the halacha that we have, or at least what's accepted in the later paskim, is that you do not say these. One of the reasons, at least we discussed this, one of the reasons we do not say these brachot when we actually do these actions, only when we do it in shul or we do it all at once at whatever point, is because people claimed that in order to say a bracha, you have to have, I'm going to share the screen after Gemara. It's in the next stuff. You have to have a clean hands, clean body. And since you sort of did this before you washed up, before you did Netilat Yadayim, so they sort of see, that's why if you look in your Siddur, the Netilat Yadayim is like the first bracha, right? So because it's all happening after you wash your hands, and then you do. And actually, in the order in the Gemara here, Netilat Yadayim is the last bracha. Or yeah, it actually doesn't have on Netilat Yadayim here. I have to see. In the Rambam, definitely it's the last bracha, because you got dressed and then you washed your hands. So in other words, it seems to be obvious from the, yeah, it is one of the last brachas, and it seems to be obvious if you follow the order of the Gemara that you're allowed to say these brachot without your hands being washed. So I don't know who came up with this chemra that you should not, and therefore they said, so you have to change the order. That actually does explicitly say that you should do it in the correct order of the Gemara, which is why I promote that practice, although I don't always do it myself. But my point is rather that if you see these brachot as sort of kavanot for these actions, for waking up, for moving your hand, for opening your eyes, for washing your face, and so on, which means that I think it's a very important thing that you don't need to get into this whole sitting on your chair with your talis to do a kavanah. You could literally do kavanot ari, and maybe you should rather do it in your bedroom when you're waking up. So yeah, so this is the kavanah of that. Now there's a bracha that corresponds to it, and I usually think of brachot themselves as sort of adding kavanot to actions, also adding speech, but also adding kavanot. Now, so the bracha for putting on shoes is shasali kotzarki. That's the Gemara says in its list, kisayim, when you put on your shoes, whatever, that's what it means. You should say shasali kotzarki. Now, nobody really knows. There's all kind of little midrashim, like pshatlach and the paskim, why this would mean this. Like Rashi doesn't say anything, and so on. Nobody knows what shasali kotzarki actually means and why it's related to putting on your shoes. I think the most simple explanation that and I think according to the Arizal's pshat, maybe we could find some sort of Kabbalistic explanation. But nobody actually knows. And we've already discussed that this is actually one of the meanings of what we say when we say that all these brachot are not really about what their actions are. They're really about what's called, the Arizal said, what's called Darko Shel Olam, right? So for example, if you say Baruch Matir Asurim for stretching out your limbs, it's also on that, but it's also a more general statement or general praise about God being the one that opens the bound things, or the people, right? Imprisoned things or imprisoned people, not necessarily imprisoned people either. Even that's just like a sort of an instance of the greater concept. And since it sort of matches, so we say it then, or the same thing, Baruch Zokef Kifufim also obviously doesn't literally, the pasuk is not meant to be literal, right? That means he raises up people that are down, or things like that. When you're in a bad mood, that's really Zokef Kifufim, more than when you're literally in your bed laying down. But we do it as with the action for the show, for the ritual symbolism of it. And therefore, that's what the Pesachim said. Therefore, if you didn't get up from bed or so on, you could still say the bracha, because it's not really about that, right? It's really about the concept. And the same thing is obviously for Shasali Katzarki. And therefore, there was a machlokes. And interestingly, that Arizal takes the other side on this machlokes. So that's a question that I have, and I have an answer. Also, this was related to Tisha B'Av, and also we should have done it earlier. But the Arizal generally says that it's true that these brachot are in shuv on what's called that kosh l'olam, the general things that they're talking about. And the way he says it is that it's not really about this world at all. He would really read that kosh l'olam, I think that's the language, as like darkam shel olamot. Like it's the way of the upper worlds. In olam atzilut, there's these structures, these rules, these patterns that we can call, for example, sleep and waking up and so on. And therefore, that is literally, at least the Rashash literally thinks that even if you don't sleep, you should say, which is, I don't think that's the halacha. At least I don't think that's correct. But people that follow the Rashash, I think, do that. Or maybe you could, actually. Maybe it is correct. I don't know. Or same thing saying, even if you didn't sleep, because it's, well, a pipshat you would say, because other people slept, right? Because sleep is not, just because you didn't sleep, the world's still, like, you're not so important. It's not all about you. And the Arizal would say it in a deeper sense. You would say even if you didn't sleep, your neshama slept, or maybe not even that, because I don't know if your neshama actually follows only the general rules and not what you do. But he would say the Atzilut, for the most part, has this concept of sleep, and it's a daily thing, and therefore you need to worship it. You need to do the avodah that's related to this, even if you personally didn't sleep. That's his reading of that kosh l'olam. And following that, it should be correct to say that, for example, so the question that the Peskim had was on Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur, when you are not allowed to put on shoes, right? Do you say Shasali Kol Tzarki? So Al Pipshat, it's related, it's the same machlokes as if you don't sleep, do you say and so on. The Arizal seems to separate them, which is kind of weird. I don't think there's any other poskim that have this kind of separation. So I don't know what's the pshat. Al pipshat, I don't know why the Arizal does that or what's going on. And also al pipshat, I think what most poskim say nowadays that since most people are wearing slippers or something, that's like not considered shoes al pi halacha, but still shoes. So you might as well make a bracha on that. But the Arizal says that he makes a chilek. He says when you don't sleep one night, so okay, everyone else is sleeping. In other words, the olam is sleeping. So just because you didn't sleep, that's not a thing. But on Tisha B'Av, he thinks that would be improper to say, or on Yom Kippur, because there's no olam that's wearing shoes, because everyone's not wearing shoes, at least all the Jews that following the halacha, and therefore he says that you should not say Shasali Kol Tzarki on Tisha B'Av. There's another question if you say it at night when you put on your shoes again, but okay, that's another question. Now, so this doesn't actually add up in the halachic reasoning of the Arizal, but it does add up, I think, in his Kabbalistic reading. In other words, if you actually think that Kosh l'olam means your friend is doing it, then maybe you could still say, what about the Goyim? I mean, does everyone keep Tisha B'Av? So, okay. Why shouldn't you say bracha for the Goyim? What's wrong? But anyways, they don't count, right? If you understand Darkosh Alam in the way that I'm understanding it, which is what I think the poskim don't understand it, that it doesn't mean literally it's someone else is doing it. It means that the bracha is more about a concept than about this specific action. It just happens to be like triggered by this action, but it's just triggering you to remember that Hashem is okef kifofim. It's not really that if you didn't do that, you can't say it. So then you wouldn't have that chat. And I think that's definitely more closer to how the Arizal reads it. But the Arizal will tell you, no, that he's actually thinks about the Olamot Elyonim having these concepts of shoes and all these things. And it's true that in Olamot Elyonim on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av, there is not whatever is corresponding to Shasali Kol Tzarki does not happen in the Olamot Elyonim. So actually a way of celebrating Tisha B'Av, just like all of our avodah is making us conform to what happens in Atzilut. So just so Tisha B'Av, by our not wearing shoes, we conform to what happens in Atzilut. And therefore, we also will not say the bracha Shasali Kol Tzarki because whatever shoes mean does not happen on Tisha B'Av. And we'll get to what it means. Maybe we'll try to understand what it means. And if it's the same as Yom Kippur or if it's Avilut or it's not, that's another whole discussion. But there's that. Okay. So basically we talked about the connection of Shasali Kol Tzarki to putting on shoes. Another interesting thing that I had to say about Shasali Kol Tzarki is that this is a non-biblical language. So most of Birkot HaShachar, I actually had a list somewhere, but I can't find it now. It's not here. Most of Birkot HaShachar are take language. I don't know why I can't find it. Maybe it's this. No, it's not this. Okay, most of Birkot HaShachar are I'll find it and I'll post it in the thing. Most of Birkot HaShachar are literally language from Psukim. So for example, well, an obvious example would be Zokef Kifrim, Bogach Ivrim, Matir Asurim. These are literally like just taking the pasuk and cutting it up and making a bracha for each part of it. Same thing for if you want to read here, for example, Yetzarat Adam Chachma is more or less based on things that say in the pasuk. Notel Nasech Vivina is the pasuk in Yov, Minatal Nasech Vivina, and so on. So most of them, I have the list to figure out exactly which ones, but almost all of them are literally psukim. One that is not a pasuk is Shasali Kotzarki. There isn't, I don't know of any pasuk which says Shasali Kotzarki, or that God gives people Kotzarkehem or something like that. It's not a biblical praise, which is weird because most filot and most brachot are based on language of psukim, tehillim, and so on. I actually did find something because it's Matzah Tisha B'Av, or so. I did find one thing. There's one pasuk in Tanakh that has the language of Kol Tzarki, and that's here. Gosh, I can't find it either now. I just had it a second ago. 1 second, it's here. Let me move it on. I'll show you. There's actually one pasuk, and it's a pasuk in. No. Here. Okay, it's a pasuk in. Oh, it doesn't have the location here. It's in Divrei Yamim, I think. Let me give a search a second. It's Divrei Yamim Bet Tetvav. This is the pasuk that has the language of Kol Tzarki, or it doesn't say Kol Tzarki, it says Kol Tzarkeka. It's here. It's talking about. Just gonna put it here for a second. It's talking about. Here, it's talking about this Hiram that built the Beit HaMikdash. He was the architect or the designer or the, I don't know, labor provider or something for the Mikdash that Shlomo built. And this is the language of like the letter or like diplomatic message that he sends to Shlomo. He says, I know that you're so smart, and I will send you a artisan that will help you design the Beit HaMikdash. By the way, both Batei Mikdash were designed by Goyish architects, totally Goyish building. First by this guy from Sidon, and the second one by Hardas, but based on Goyish ideas. Okay, and anyways, and it said like this: "V'anachnu nichrot etzim en alvanon kechol tzarkecha, v'nevi'em lecha." So we're gonna float the wood down the ocean from Yaffo to Jerusalem. Well, not from Yaffo, from higher, from Sidon, and they will have that. So that's the only place that their language of Kol Tzarkeka, as in whatever you will need or everything you will need, exists in the biblical language. What do we learn from this? Yeah, you can make the drasha yourself. Kol Tzarki is very much a rabbinic language. Chazal have a lot of times Ism Kol Tzarka, and whenever they have to say that you're allowed to do whatever you need, or someone that is given or provided everything it needs, to have this language of Kol Tzarki. And it seems like if you want to think a little more of what it would mean, there's a certain abundance and a certain taking caretaking in that, where it's like there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different things we could talk about. Like all the Birkot HaShachar are talking about God providing for the world or providing for managing things. Hashgacha pratit or hashgacha klalit. Right, we talk about God being the one who cares about the poor people. He gives tired people koyach, all kind of things like that. And then we could give like the most general thing, like it's almost like shakal nebedvara, like, and he gives everyone everything they need. That's like the, how's it called? Like the blank check kind of care. And it's very general, and it really means it's really a blank check. And Chiram is really giving Shlomo a blank check. Is getting, I'm going to give you as much wood as you need. Well, we have a huge forest. There's enough, but he's still giving him whatever he needs. Atzel Vanon, it's also in the Haftorah of Yeshaya. It's like always Vanon and die something. There's more than enough for everyone. It's always an expression of abundant material. And that is a sort of, I think that's a sort of geula. A lot more than if you talk about Hashem Zokef Kifufim, that's talking about Galut. Because it's talking about, okay, when we're poor, God provides for us, or when we're broken, so he could fix it and so on. But giving you everything you need is actually a much more, how would we say? It's a richer experience. It actually means that you're not missing anything. If you want to want to think of a more earlier biblical term for this, you would think of the pasuk that talks about in Dvarim. It talks about Eretz Yisrael. Talks about lo techsar kol ba, right? It's not missing anything. It's just sort of the corresponding thing to shasali kol tzarki. That's a state of geula, and it's another way of saying it. It's a state where the world, as it is, or what's known as ulam asiyah, which is where we are in all of Birkot HaShachar, actually has enough, right? It's post scarcity. How do you say? Actually has enough to provide for everyone, and that's, if you will see, the Ramak and others were interested in shasali kol tzarki in the term of shasa, right? It's not shehetzili kol tzarki or sheyatzar kol tzarki and so on. It's literally shasa. Another way of saying it would be that we have a way to accept the big problem of olam asiyah generally. Is that since it's Atziyah, it's very bound world. It's very mitzumtzam. It's very limited in all kinds of ways. In other words, it's hard for it to receive the higher chef or the greater things and what we call greater worlds. And Shasali Kol Tzarki is literally Binyan Beit HaMikdash. So we could put everything into this world. We could put everything, and by the correct ways, and we'll see how shoes means that and so on. But there's the correct ways of doing that, and by making sure you don't get bumps in your feet from walking on stones and so on, all the things that shoes help you for. So that would be Shasali Kol Tzarki. And now the connection, Apip Shat, just so you know, Apip Shat, I think the most reasonable explanation for how this connects at all to, for how this all connects to putting on your shoes, is that Shasali Kol Tzarki is really a bracha on starting your day. So like all these Birkot HaShachar basically ways for like starting your engine. Shasali Kol, like we have, right, to go back to the Gemara, when you put your feet on the ground, you say if you walk, you say and again, that means it's talking about God leading you, right? He prepares, or I don't know how you say it means prepare, but not prepare. It means like he takes care of the ways in which you will walk today. It doesn't mean now, right? It means, and the same thing putting on shoes is like, the difference is, I think the way that they explained it is, the difference is you start to walk already when you're home. Then you get to the door basically, and you put on your shoes to go out. And when you go out, that's where you're going to take care of Kol Tzarki, right? But people go out to work, to take care of their lives outside of their homes. And for that, you say the bracha Shasali Kol Tzarki. So really, it's more about going out of your house. And we'll see that also matches to the sod more than putting on shoes. It's just that shoes are the embodied thing that you do in order to put on, right? Shoes are the things that belong by the door. At least in many cultures, they take off their shoes when they walk into a house and put them on when they go out. It doesn't really make sense to wear shoes in your house, right? Unless the floor is cold or something. Yeah, so that's the pshat of Shasali Kol Tzarki. Now we have to go to another right? That more or less makes sense, right? So we have we spoke about two things meanwhile. We spoke about the question of how the Shasali Kaltzorki, the little, I keep on talking about thinking of the little action or the little bracha or the little kavanah relates to the whole big narrative, the whole big story of the world, which it talks about, and how that is actually how all these brachot work, right? We have this little action, and then we remind myself of Darko Shel Olam and what Darko Shel Olam means for the Arizal. That's the number one. And number two was how this language, we talked about this language of Shasali Kaltzorki, which is actually probably the greatest language in all the brachot. Again, some Hasidic Pshat said that if you say Shasali Kaltzorki, then you must actually have everything. Otherwise, you're a liar. Like there's some stories of a poor guy that came to a Rebbe and said, "What do you mean? I say Shasali Kaltzorki?" And it's not true. I don't have everything. And it's like, you have to have bitachon or something. I don't know exactly the answer. You have whatever you need. Like that's what my mother says. You don't have to be rich, you have to have whatever you need. Okay. But it does mean that, but it doesn't. I don't think it actually literally means you have everything you need. I mean, it actually means that whatever I am going to do is God providing for me. It's a little different nuance. I don't think that Chassidish story is the pshat, but it is the pshat. And when you bring on your shoes, and therefore we connect it to the abundance of. That's why in Tanakh it's in building the Beis Hamikdash. We're talking about Eretz Yisrael, that's why, and that's already a reason why, right? That's already a deep shot. I didn't finish that. That's already why, if you talk about taking off your shoes on Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur in a slightly different style, but similar, it really means that I'm not going out today, right? It really means the world is not working, so therefore I'm not wearing shoes. That's the practice of ilut, or taking off your shoes, and so on. I think that's also maybe one of the reasons we have to also think about this concept when we talk about this whole concept, which very ancient concept of taking off your shoes in a sacred place, right? Actually, there were some machronim, the Yaras Devash and others, that discussed that not wearing shoes on Tisha B'Av is sort of to remember that in the Beis Hamikdash you don't wear shoes. So to remember that you don't wear shoes in the whole world on Tisha B'Av, something like that. And then they would sort of go on and to explain the meaning of that, but that's another thing. In any case, what was I saying? I was saying that shoes is something about going out. So that's really a third meaning, right? The first thing was about the second, third point, right? It's about having everything, and it's also about going out. In other words, that's how you have everything, because you need to go out and get everything. I need to have the correct protections in order to be able to go out in the world. And when you can't, either because the world is too horrible, or because you just don't have anything, or because it's Yom Kippur and you just don't want to care about the world, you want to be higher than that, then you're gonna not wear shoes. And I was saying, that's probably one of the reasons why there's more reasons we'll see that relate to the protection part. Everything is really the same thing, but that's why we have by the Sneh and in the Beis Hamikdash and so on, that you take off your shoes when you're in a sacred space. It sort of seems to mean, or seems to symbolize, how part of the being in the sacred space is that you're not going anywhere. That's a place of rest. Bet menuchati, right? You're not going anywhere. You're not working. So therefore, like, calm down, take off your shoes, make yourself comfortable. That's the at least one of the points in that. Okay, so that's the story with with the general Shasali Kaltzorki and its connection to putting on your shoes, and the connection of that to the whole world. Okay. Now we're getting back to the actual action of putting on your shoes, and that's where the Arizal starts. I'm here. So the Arizal started with another little halachic point, but he very quickly made that into include his whole system of Kabbalah. And the halachic story is that there's actually a machlokes, and the Arizal, I'm going to read the Sha'ar Kavanas, and you'll see. There's a machlokes which order to put on your shoes. And because we don't know what to do with this machlokes, we sort of do this thing of Yirelihim Yetzideshnem and Mashatekne Apoiskim. And actually, it's not the Poiskim, it's already in the Gemara. This, and the Mefarshim already all noticed. He means to say the Gemara, or whatever. And we have sort of a pshara, which is Sheilbash Tchila Shelimin, so that we put on first the right shoe and we don't tie it, and then we tie the left shoe first, if you have shoes that can tie, and then you tie the right shoe. And if there are no ties, then you'll just do the right before the left. That's the Arizal's way of putting the achran. It's actually not as simple as he makes it out to be. Again, we have to find, I'm going to find it in a second. We have to find the Gemara and talk about this a little and then get to how the Arizal gets to it. So this is in Sechtes. 1 second, I have to answer the phone. Okay. Back to where we are. This is actually a Gemara in Shabbos. Daf, what did it say here? Samach Aleph. Interestingly, also on Daf Samach. There's a very, for some reason, this is one of the things that people talk always about, halacha being worried about very little things. But we'll see about this in a second. So this is actually in Shabbos over here. It actually somehow associates with, I'm here. It somehow associates with the question of putting on, if you have, of wearing one shoe on Shabbos, basically. So you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. You are allowed to carry if it's like clothing. And there's some takanut chachamim about certain kinds of clothing, like jewelry and others in different situations, where they said that since you're not really using it as clothing, you might take it off. So they made you a gzeirah that you should not wear those kinds of clothing. So one of the gzeirot that chachamim said was that you should not wear one shoe only. If you wear one shoe, that's we consider that's carrying that shoe, because for two reasons Rashi explains. One is, since you're only wearing one shoe, you might like be uncomfortable or something and take it off. People might make fun of you when you'll take it off. Like, why is the guy wearing one shoe? So, okay, let's make it even and wear no shoes, which is somehow better. Another reason is that people might think that you were holding the other shoe, and we don't want people to think that you're carrying on Shabbos. Okay. Now, there's an exception to this, which is that when you have a makkah, you have a wound or something on one shoe, on one foot, then you are allowed to wear only one shoe, basically for the same reason, because it's obvious that you're wearing one shoe only because, well, this is what the question is going to be: which one is the one that you're wearing? But in any case, the point is that then there's like a reason for why you're only wearing one shoe, and then you were not worried about you taking it off. So there was a machlokes. Why am I reading this whole Gemara? Why not? Okay, I think it's connected to everything, but maybe we'll have to figure out how. So there was a machlokes. Which one is the one that you're allowed to wear when you have a makkah and one shoe? So Ravina said the one that has a wound, obviously. In other words, and the Gemara explains, he obviously understands. Alma kasava sandal l'shem tzara. In other words, Ravina understands why do people wear shoes, or what this shoe, at least in this case, is why do people wear a shoe? Generally, you could just walk around barefoot. You wear it to be comfortable, right? So your foot doesn't get caught or pricked by the stuff you're walking on, and therefore, if you have some wound on your foot, that's even better reason why you should not want it to get bumped up from the rocks and stones on the floor. So it makes sense to wear only on that shoe. And your other shoe, you're not such a particular person. You don't really mind that you're getting walk barefoot. Okay. And there was another shitter, Chia Barav, said that no, he's wearing his single shoe on the one that doesn't have. And the Gemara explains the reason is that he understands that people wear shoes for pleasure, I think that pleasure is really the same kind of pleasure. It still makes it more comfortable. For some reason, it's like more focusing on it being pleasurable to wear shoes. And since the one shoe has a wound, so apparently it would hurt him somehow to put it on. So, or pleasure would say, in other words, it's like an extra thing. It's like just a luxury item to wear shoes. And therefore he's wearing it like where he's feeling better and not where he's feeling worse. Okay. So, anyways, I'm interested in the thought here, it's less than in the halacha and all these calculations of which shoe the guy is wearing and which he's not allowed to. So this is a very general question in everything in life, and also adds up to what Arizal going to get to, which is: are you doing it in order to escape suffering, to run away from some problems, or are you doing it to promote well-being or to enjoy life? And it's sometimes hard to discern the difference between these two, right? If you can ask a Buddhist, they'll say that everything is just escaping suffering. But in the Gemara, and actually in Halacha, in many different contexts, it's very, very much lives with this distinction. And I'll get to other contexts where, and people are, in Halacha, it's actually, again, complicated because it's very close, these things. Like, what is the difference, for example, between washing up l'shem ta'anug, which is asur and navilut, or and so on, or washing just because you're dirty, right? These are two different, in other words, l'shem, what's called in halacha asarat hatzar or asarat halichluch, and so on. But I think that slightly more deeper, slightly more existentially or kabbalistically, there's always going to be two ways. And in the Kabbalah way of saying it would be: are you doing this to be mamshich moichen, to be mamshich shefa, to be mamshich yichud, and so on, all the good stuff that we want to get? In other words, you're doing the good, or are you doing it to escape the bad, or what we'd call in Kabbalah to be doched chitzonim, right? Because to them everything bad ultimately means klipot or chitzonim, however you want to call them, evil forces, the evil parts of the world, and you need to push them away. And if one of the interesting things in Kitvei Ari is that he focuses actually a lot on pushing away the chitzonim, slightly more than you would expect, I think, or at least what I would expect. I think that the Chassidish interpretations of the Arizal take this lesson into account generally, because they're more interested in the pleasure, or the ultimate pleasure, achieving God, or bringing Ashrat Ashkina. These are the pleasurable, the things that are totally tikkun. They're not so much interested in worrying about demons or whatever, however you want to conceptualize chitzanim. But it's still true that a big part of life is, and it's not another thing that's true, and what's even more true in that is that these two things are very, very intimately connected. Because chitzanim is really, and it's literally called chitzanim, in other words, the outer parts, or klipot, right? Klipot really just means shells or peels, right? Like the klipa of onion or the klipa of a nut, which Zohar always refers to when he uses the language of klipa. In other words, the way the world is built in every level means that if you want to build something good, you need to know how to deal with the bad that comes with it. There is no good that doesn't have bad right behind the door. We'll see later in the Arizal's language, right after the Shechina, right after the Nukta Atzilut is Klipot, right there. And therefore, there is no building of any good thing without actually building in protection, building in shields. That is usually actually uses the language of shields, or we could say clothing, right? We could literally say the same thing. And we could talk about clothing, or we could talk about clothing or shoes as having this dual function, which sort of it's the same actual thing, but it has these both functions, and we could focus on one or focus on the other. And that is actually, later you'll see, connects these to the right and the left. But you could actually focus on these two functions, right? Sometimes we talk about clothing as being just protective, like some clothing they're not nice, they don't have any aesthetic function or any social function. They're just to make sure you don't get wet in the rain if you have some raincoat or something like that. And at the same time, they also provide you comfort. Comfort is a little tricky thing, because maybe it's comfort can also mean, that I don't get hurt or wet or cold or something like that. But you could say talk about honor. One of the weird things in modern liberal kind of ways of thinking is that they have very few ways of talking about whatever is beyond running away from pain. one of the weird things, and for example, in people talk about this, right? The positive psychology movement is really talks about this, and others. You end up with a very I'm not going to get into that too much, but I think that's why I'm struggling to say what's not running away from pain, or what's not just protection. But if we talk about honor, we talk about and honor also not only in the sense of I'm more important than you, I have better clothes than you, and as a thing for itself, as what we call kavod, not in the sense of kavod just as being more powerful than you, but in the sense of being dignified, or in the sense of being elevated, having a higher, again, we're using metaphors, but having a higher state of life, a better kind of life, right? The more lively life is really what I like to say usually, being more alive. And then these are two distinct things, but they very much go together with each other. And this is another mistake, or the opposite mistake that we could make, just like we could make the mistake of like just being like a Buddhist that says that everything is just about escaping suffering, which is not true, by the way. It's not true. Life is not only about escaping suffering. In other words, life is not only suffering. In the same way, you could say that we often forget about the other part. In other words, people very often have very good ideas, very positive ideas, and they don't create any left side in that, or no small doche, or no way to protect from the bad that comes with it. So that's the important point to notice. The bad is lived, that's what I said. There's not, the bad actually is the good thing misinterpreted. There's no other definition of bad, really, basically, or misdirected. So anytime you're going to have something good, you're going to have to, and misdirection can have many levels, like we talk about in explaining the klipot generally. Did I give you this explanation there? Talk about just slightly misdirected, which is, we talk like closer klipa or klipat noga, we talk sometimes, and so on. And then you can talk about when it actually gains sort of agency of its own. So the example I usually bring, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I mean, I know where I'm going with this, but stop me if I'm flying away too far. The example I usually give with this is appetite. So appetite is literally what you need in order to enjoy actually anything. We talk about physical appetite for food, right? It's what you need to be able to eat and to enjoy food. And food actually makes you, again, you could talk about eating just to survive. In other words, to not die, which is the lowest level of not dying or not suffering. And you talk about it as being one of the pleasures of life. We could say bracha, birkot hanehenen, right? Because it's a good thing to enjoy your food. It's one of the pleasures of being alive, or at least human pleasures, right? I don't know how animals and other beings experience it, but for humans, it's one of the things. Now, this always has a klipa, and actually one of the very klipot we know very intimately well, right? For example, at the end, and this is why people think that it's very mystical, like very weird, like that is the Kabbalim talk about giving space or figuring out what to do with the klipa at every meal, talk about mayim achron and different things. It's actually like the most normal, natural thing, because every time you're going to have a meal, and literally like 3 times a day, or as often as you eat, you're going to be using the appetite, which is, we call it tzad small, but not getting into that, or the kli, right? The vessel in which your food is going to go into, or your pleasure is going to go into. And that pleasure is a great thing. It's there for a good reason, because otherwise you wouldn't eat, or otherwise it's not only has like a reason, it's good in itself when it's working in harmony with everything else. And now weirdly, human beings have a defect, and nobody knows why. I mean, maybe I do know why. It seems, at least in some version of explaining this, but you get like theodicy, there isn't really a way to make it otherwise, that the appetite takes a life of its own. So you like sweet things because sweet things generally are good for your body. And then you want to eat one more sweet thing that's not good for your body anymore. So that's the closest klipa, right? And then if you just eat one extra portion of dessert, that's not too bad. Maybe it's a good thing. That's permissive. Maybe that's recommended. So you don't become some sort of litvak has no life, right? But then you can go with level. There's a lot of levels of this, right? Up to like and deathly levels, literally deathly levels, right? And then we could talk about the klipa, in other words, which is just the appetite misinterpreted or misdirected, right? Not used for its purpose. We're not working in harmony with all the other systems of the body and the soul, taking a life on its own. For example, and my example for this would be some big company that literally figured out what people's taste buds like and figured out how to make it the most cheap without adding any nutrients into that chips or whatever, like really engineered things. It's called super stimuli, something like that. And the idea is just that's literally klipa. That's like a demon, and that's where we're surrounded by these demons. Like all of advertisement is literal demons. In other words, literal demons in the metaphysical sense of things that have a purpose and then are supposed to serve a greater whole, and then took agency by themselves, like Satan, being murdered and whatever, Milton, and taking agency of their own and actually being destructive to the purpose of themselves and of everything else. Okay, where are we getting to? So therefore, every time you're going to eat, which is a good thing, which is just an example of a good thing, you're going to need to have a plan from the beginning of how to make sure that you are able to receive the good, or you're able to receive the pleasure. In other words, which means using the pleasure, the appetite, without, and also to push away the klipa, right? And this is how the Mekabilim conceptualize many different mitzvahs, many different rituals, as being the part of the action, which is small docha, which is pushing away the klipa that comes along. So, for example, you could talk about, I don't know, the netilat yadayim, right? Or there's the washing before you have a meal or after you have a meal, which is literally a sort of, that is, we talked about kavanat netilat yadayim in the beginning, right? That is, has this idea of like the end, again, the end of the body being klipa, like your fingernails and your hair, stuff like that, and them needing to be trimmed, them needing to be washed. So you talk about washing your hands or washing nagelvas or washing your, making, so that's built into the system, a way to protect itself from its own, not deficiencies, but the opposite of deficiency, overflows, right? In the same way, getting back to getting back to getting dressed, you could have sandal l'shem tsar, right? Which is again the lowest level, and you could have sandal l'shem tanig. I just want to have nice shoes, or I just want to be a human being, which is, and actually one of the symbols that people talk about in shoes is that it sort of symbolizes the person literally stepping on the ground, being above the ground, or like under the ground is under your boot, right? We use this language in English for like some sort of power control. And it's actually, that's why, and some people said that's why, if you see this as a good thing, and in some measure it's a good thing, that's why they say that Shasali Kotsarki is set on putting on shoes, because shoes are what separates the human from the earth, or in other words, what separates you from what can be called lowly or not refined. So anyways, that's the first level. And then you have also l'shem tanig. Okay. Now this was all just because usually I do these kind of things for Ketvei Ari. Now I showed you that you could do it for Gemara also, the same kind of medrash that makes it actual. Okay. And that's also based on Ketvei Ari. I'll do the same thing to that soon. Now, continuing in the Gemara and Shabbos, Rabbi Yochanan also agreed. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan also agreed with Rav Huna that said that we wear the shoe on the one that has the wound, because there was a story like this. Rabbi Yochanan told his shamash, or I don't know if it was his shamash or his student, he asked him to give him his shoes. So he gave him the right shoe. And Rabbi Yochanan told him, he said, you're treating me as if I have a wound on my foot. In other words, he understood that the only reason why someone would put their right shoe first would be if he's not putting on his left foot and his left shoe, his left one. In other words, he has a wound on his right one, so therefore he's wearing it on the other one. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan holds the other way around, right? Yeah, this is complicated. Right. So obviously, right. It's like Rav. Otherwise, he understands that people wear the one. If person is going to wear only one shoe, he's going to wear it on the one which has a how do you call it, which has the wound. And the Gemara says no, maybe it didn't mean that. Maybe it didn't mean that. Okay, so this is not a proof regarding this question, but we're going to skip that part. It's not our question now. And anyways, the Gemara says that Rebbe Yochanan is working in the mind with his shita. And Rebbe Yochanan's shita was ketfilin ma kach min ulen, ma tefillin b'smoil, af min ulen b'smoil. Rebbe Yochanan had an opinion that said just like tefillin you put on your left hand, same thing, shoes you put on your left. Well, not only on your left, but your left first. So therefore, if someone gave him the right first, he was mad. He said that you're doing it the wrong way. And the only reason he could fathom for someone doing it the wrong way would be if he has a wound on one foot, which makes him not be able to put it on both feet as shoes. Okay. And then, so this is the shita of Rebbe Yochanan. So that's the machlokas that Rizal was referring to. Rebbe Yochanan's shita was that you put the left shoe first. And why? And he said, it's like tefillin. Just like tefillin goes on the left foot, left hand. Sorry, not on the foot. The same way shoes goes on the left foot, or the left foot first. Reb. And then the Gemara says, Maisva, that there's a brayso that held differently. So the brayso said the opposite, and this is I think it said the opposite. It said you put the right first. So this is a machloek, so we have a machloekas. Okay, so now what do? So Rebbe Yochanan said you could do whatever you want. Then Abaye said, "What do you mean? Maybe Rebbe Yochanan didn't hear of the Mishnah or Brayso. If he would have heard it, he would have followed it because it was before him. So maybe not. We don't know. Basically, the Menachem then. So there's another shit. So this one opinion is Rebbe Yochanan. So we're gonna find that there's three opinions in the Gemara for what to do halacha l'maaseh. The number one is Rebbe Yochanan's opinion, which is the you could do whatever you. Well, I'm not sure if it means you could do whatever you want. You'll see. It means that if you do this way, you're doing it well, and if you're doing that way, you're doing it well. And then we have Yitzchok Shita, which says and Mani Mabre. When he heard this person was Yiresh Shemayim, and this is a pusik Yiresh Shemayim, that's Yirelehim Yitzchok. And how did he do it? He first put on his right shoe and he didn't tie it, and then he tied the left first. So he did both the right first and the left first. And we have a third shita, which is Rav Kahana, which is loy kopid. And according to how the way the Mefarshim explain, loy kopid is different from Rav Yochanan that said the ovadochi, meaning to say. And now this is to answer the question that you should be asked, which is what is this deal with having halacha about which side of shoes to put first. So it's actually a machlokas if there's such a halacha. In other words, there was Rebbe Yochanan's shita, which was that there was such an halacha, and the Mishnah's shita, the Brayso shita. Both of them said, at least both of them had a consistent opinion of which one you should do first. And now you see the way the Amoreim responded to that was to say that whichever way you do is good. And the way this, so the media explains it like this. He says, really, it's not the most important thing in the world which way you put your shoes. But it's a nice thing, unlike the Bechman said, and this is a very interesting statement because he literally related putting on your shoes to wearing tefillin. And now these are two totally different things. Putting on your shoes is just, people wear shoes. And putting on tefillin is like a mitzvah, and not only a mitzvah, it's probably like a very important mitzvah. It talks about the existence of God. Tefillin is actually like it's a ois, right? It's one of the important mitzvahs. And the Rebbe just like casually correlated these two things. In other words, Rebbe Yochanan said we can have the same kavanah by putting on your shoes as you have by putting on your tefillin. And this is a very radical thing that he said. And of course, the media didn't say it as radical as I did. He just said that it would be a nice thing to remember God when you're putting on your shoes by associating it with tefillin. So like when he wanted to do Kabbalat al-Malchus Shemaim already by putting on his shoes. So he said, well, I'm going to do it the same way I do my tefillin. And therefore I'll remember that God exists and in his presence and all of that. So that's one way. And then there's another way. That's the media, if you'll see. Now the Mishnah had a different opinion. And according to the media, they both meant the same thing. But the Mishnah just said you should do the right first. Why? And why right? Because right is generally associated with the good side. I don't really know why. I think generally because most people are right-handed, so the right is like the stronger side. So the right gets associated in Kabbalah generally, right? Very, very much chesed and din is right and left. But generally in Chazal and in Judaism generally, the right is always associated with the good side, or with the stronger side. And they also gave this sort of a spiritual meaning, apparently. So they said it's not only the stronger side, it's also the better side. Well, why do we put on tefillin on the weak hand? That's a good question. But it's literally the drasha yad keha, we put tefillin on the weak hand. But generally, we always want to promote the right side of everything. Like we say, you want to do the right way, right? In English, there's also the right way is the same thing as the right side. Not no connection to the right and the left in politics, but that's another. And therefore, by putting on your right first, you'll remember you put on right first. Similar, it's sort of backwards first, because probably, for example, we put the mezuzah on the right side because it's the stronger side, the more dominant side generally. In other words, you want to remember God when you're being dominant or when you're using your power or where your power is. But somehow that trickles down like all kinds of associations, and it trickles down to actually making the right side the good side, and therefore by putting the right side first, you're sanctifying the act of putting on your shoes. So these are the two conflicting opinions. And what the Meiri says, what the Rebbe meant when he said David came out of it, is just that I don't care which association you're using as long as you're getting to God in the end. So you want to do in the way of doing the right first, to do the right first. You want to do in the way of doing the left first, you do the left first. That both of them are legitimate. And this is a very, I hold of this way of thinking. Although the Rizal maybe doesn't hold of it so much, but the Chassidim definitely do hold of it. It's actually one of the hard, I forget who told me. I know who, but there was a source for it. One of the things my teacher said is that one of the hard things for people to accept is how every way you're going to use to get to God is legitimate. There aren't really things that have inherent goodness. I mean, there are obviously things, but these kind of things, or which way you do it, whatever you do is good, and how you do it is good, as long. So, in other words, another way of saying this would be that the ikar is the kavanah. Putting on your left shoe first, while having no intention in that, is not better than putting on your right shoe with a different intention that also has a way of getting you to remember God. So the main thing is to associate it. And I do think that it's true for Kabbalah also. Kabbalah has, we'll keep on talking this, and especially if you read Shara Kavanot, it keeps on having these things where like every tiny little detail can mean the whole world. So therefore you have to be very careful about the detail itself. But then you read a little bit more Kabbalah, and actually the Arizal himself, by the way, yeah, it is, because in this Delish, for example, the Arizal does show you the meaning, the reasoning behind both shittas, right? In other words, because then you read the next page and you see, well, he says, for example, let's talk about the right, doing the right first. You will say, well, the right is chesed and the left is gevura, and therefore you want to promote chesed over gevura and so on. Okay. And then you go to the next page and you say, well, it's actually much more important to take care of gevura than to take care of chesed, because once you have gevura, then chesed flows by itself, something like that, for example. So in other words, the remes can work always both ways. Once when you're in the realm of doing symbolic actions and trying to find associations, it doesn't really matter what the associations are. We have to. I actually think it's important to keep the freedom, to keep the playfulness of. There's a remes for everything, and people laugh at it. Like people say, "Well, the Mekabalim are interested in gematria and all kind of fuzzy stuff, and you could say make a gematria. You can make anything gematria whatever you want, so it's useless." Well, it's just the opposite. Because you can make it whatever you want, that's why it's useful. Because that gives you a way in every situation and every kind of way to associate it to a train that leads you directly to God, right? So like, for example, if you have like a multi-purpose, if you have like a train wagon, how's it called, one piece of a train, I don't know, trailer, car, and the one that has a hook only in the front is less useful than one that has a hook in both ways. And no person would come and say, well, that's a useless train, we don't know which way to hook it up to the locomotive, right, to the driver thing. And they'd say, no, it's useful from its right side, and it's useful from its left side. In the same way, the world, and this is how they conceptualize the Torah and the world and everything, the fact that everything is gematria, everything is actually a good thing, because it makes it all purpose. It makes one size fits all kind of. It makes it being able to be connected from any side. And the main thing is that you do it. Of course, there's wrong ways to do things. I'm not getting into that, but it's actually useful to realize that David came out of it is one of my big you said this of it Hashem for me. If you do it this way, it's good. If that way, it's good. The one thing that's not good is not having any intention, or thinking that if you do it the wrong way, then you ruined everything. It doesn't actually work that way. So that's Rebbe Yochanan's opinion. Then the opposite opinion, the last opinion that we said, Rav Kahana's opinion, which is Loy Kupid, that's apparently the other opinion that disregards this. It says, well, I'm not, you see the Ritva here says, Shem Epsayim Hashem. In other words, you're worried that there's something bad will happen by putting your left foot forward. Nothing bad will happen. It's not important to be worried about these kind of things. That's the Ritva connects us to the idea that we say in Masechtas Psuchim, where it talks also back to the demons and stuff like that. There's all kind of things that people were makbid about demons, like drinking two pairs of things at once, like 2 cups of water is dangerous because for some reason demons have something with the number 2 or with the concept of pairs, and it's dangerous. And then anyways, they want to finish that whole discussion by saying that if you're worried about this, then be worried. But if man the like up din about that. In other words, if you don't care about this, the demons won't care about it either. So there's a lot of different ways of reading that. But so in this context, I'm gonna give you 2 ways, which I think both are important. One is the way of saying, Loykop, in other words, he was more of a rash. He didn't care about symbolism so much. He was like, I'm gonna do my avodas Hashem by putting on tefillin, my shoes, whichever way. I don't care. That's one legitimate way of reading it. Another way is, or the second level of that is that also has a very important meaning. There's obviously like a psychological meaning where OCD is not a good thing, or in other words, we're not thinking of white elephants makes you think of them, right? So it's not always good to directly, for example, if you assume that, let's say, left is associated with klipot or with dealing with klipot even, and therefore we need to have this whole order. And there is an actual derech navat Hashem to just ignore things. Ignoring is a legitimate and important tool to have in your toolbox. So, for example, I don't know what kind of problems people have. If you have some yetzer hara or some bad thing that you keep on doing, and you're like, well, I was taught that you can't do a mitzvah correctly. Well, you can do a mitzvah, but you can't like achieve what it needs to achieve before doing tshuva and everything, and before being pure. And since I have this thing, so it's a big problem. And you could do something called mandalay kupit like kaptin about that. I don't care. Just don't care. It's not important. If you have different people are worried about machshavot zarot, people used to be worried about that. So it's also a language to think. Or there's actually a Chassidish tradition in Rapchitz. The tradition was that anything that it says in Kabbalah or in Halacha that we do it because of we're worried about chitzonim or worried about a lot of different random vedot about this. They were not good at any of these. Or in other words, they didn't like making a big deal of it because they said once you make a big deal, then you're letting yourself into a fight, and you're giving them too much importance by fighting with them. This is good advice for Twitter. If you don't get how do you say, offended by what some stupid person said, then you're not going to be offended. Instead of like getting into all the fights and being worried and getting on the right side of everything, you just don't care, and then you're free from the whole problem. But it's also advice for more inner stuff or more intimate stuff in many different directions. And sometimes the like Frimkeit says you have to care about everything. There's also a Frimkeit that says just don't care about that. Like don't worry about that. You'll worry about it when you have the capacity or whenever or never. But it's not important. Just go on and do what you need to do, and don't worry about all the complicated negative stuff. So that's another way of living the thing with shoes. And it's also legitimate. The Rambam, for example, does not pass on this halacha of which shoes you should put. And apparently the reason is because he didn't like this kind of symbolism. In other words, he thought that Avodat Hashem should be, however you do it is good, as long as you have first do it. Like the hard part is to do it, not to find the correct way of doing it. So that's one thing about Mandalay Kapid. Like Kapitina Badai. I had something else that I wanted to say about this, but I don't remember what it was. And then we have the middle opinion, which is actually what gets brought in Shulchan Aruch and what Arizal is going to go about. And we have to, I think the middle opinion is actually based on the third opinion in some way. Well, there's different ways of understanding it. We'll see in the Arizal how he understands it. And the third way is like the firm way, which is right? If you have so much fear of God, so you have to make sure you're covered on a basis. So you figure out to do both, somehow to do both. So that's the bad way of explaining it. The good way of explaining it is that you could actually have the good parts of both. And the way it generally gets explained in halacha, or Tosfos already says that, and that's why just Arizal seems to quote Tosfos. That's Tosfos. If you want to see Tosfos, you'll see. Tosfos says Rivu, right? This is where the Arizal is coming from. With the second part that he said that depends on the tying, because Tosfos came up with this idea. The Rivu and Tosfos came up with this idea that maybe really there's not a machloikis. In other words, maybe there's a difference between the tying and the putting on. So when you have shoes that have laces or something, then there's an action of tying them and the action of wearing them. Now, if you think about why did Rebbe Yochanan get this idea that tefillin are similar to shoes, because both of them have the tying action going on. So therefore, Tosfos says that maybe it's really not the putting on the shoes that we're worried about being before the left first. It's really the tying shoes, right? So therefore, Tosfos says, therefore, this is really the question he's coming to answer is why this person, the Marbred Ravina that did both, why didn't he do the other way around? In other words, if you're just looking for a way to do both the left first and the right first, wouldn't he put on the left first and then tie the right first, right? And he said, no, it has to be this way because he actually understood that this way he's not only like doing a pshura, he's not only like half and half, he's actually doing the entire of both shittas, because the idea of Yimin Tchilas is one idea. Well, he's not entirely doing that shit, but at least entirely doing the shit of Rebbe Yochanan, which is that the kshira has to be first in for the left because it's related to the tefillin, right? And therefore, you have to bedafka do the left first for the left tying first, and then you could do and not the opposite, not the other way around. And therefore, based on this reasoning, came some other person, I don't remember who was the first to say that, and said that therefore, if you have shoes that do not have any tying, so what do? Then we're just going to revert to the general idea of putting it the right first. Also, because you see that this person, if we go with this person's pshura, then he put on the right first. It's just the tying. But if there's no tying, then we don't even have any shita that says that you should do the left shoe first, because there's no relation to tefillin. Then the relation to tefillin is only in the tying. So this is the pshura of the Nachman Yitzchok as Tosfos understood it, and as that Arizal assumes that it's related to the tying aspect. Now we have to go back to our pshat and explain just in preliminary pshat, and next class we'll get to the Arizal's more in-depth explanation. Why is this connection? What does this mean in the symbolism of the Kabbalah and the symbolism of the Arizal and the Zohar already? This means something like this. Why actually do we tie our tefillin on the left hand? So the Zohar says that since left symbolizes, or not only symbolizes, actually has some connection or some touch with the klipa, with the Yetzer Hara, with the Samach Mem, the Zohar says, and therefore we need to subdue the Yetzer Hara by tying it. So tying your tefillin on your left hand is sort of the action of tying down the Samach Mem and not allowing him to be free. So the opposite of Matira Surim, right? There's tying him down. And in other words, tefillin besmal, Kabbalah literally means tefillin is for being machnia the tzad small. And this is obviously connected with the concept of kshira. So we definitely understand that the left side of shoes, which and to me this also goes back to the Gemara with tzad and tanik, right? This part of shoes that are to tanik. According to that, you would be putting on the left shoe first, which is Rabbi Yochanan's shitta, but it doesn't entirely match up with the Shakota, what I'm saying. But anyways, but that would be the part. But the part of being mamshich moichin, for example, of shoes, or being the good part, the positive side of it, that actually stays with the left. And therefore, if you have some sort of kind of shoe, which somehow doesn't have any left side, in other words, doesn't have any tying going on, which would mean that kind of style of shoe or whatever it is not related to doing this act of being machnia the Yetzer Hara, then you would revert to the standard, which is that the right side is more important. Okay, so this was laying the base framework of halacha and Gemara, which the Arizal is having in mind and working with, and also showing you how you could literally do everything I do with the Arizal to the Gemara. You don't need to do only the Kitzveri. And next time we'll get further into the Arizal's actual structure. You'll see what in other words, what he explains what levush and shoes, what all these things mean in Olam Atzilut, and how all of this makes sense if you think in that way. Okay. Am I good? Okay. It's okay.